to Japan. Acting Defense Secretary Patrick
Hello and welcome to Bloomberg Quint. You're watching the fine print. There are over 50 circulars, 183 frequently asked questions, and surviving framework of the foreign institutional investment regime that governs SEBI's 2014 FPI regulations. Over the last 5 years, foreign portfolio investors, or FPIs, have complained of challenges around registration, know your customer requirements, disclosures around their beneficial owners, investment limits, etc. And so, last year, SEBI set up a committee led by H.R. Khan to consolidate, rationalize, liberalize, and simplify the FPI regime. So, has the committee achieved these objectives with its recommendations? To answer that, I have with me Siddharth Shah from Khaitan and Richie Sancheti from Nishit Desai Associates. Gentlemen, welcome to the fine print. Siddharth, the committee has suggested, changes to the registration process, the KYC requirements, investment restrictions, etc. And I'll come to all of that. But broadly, do you think the committee has done justice with the objective of simplifying the FPI regime? And are there areas which you were hoping the committee would address, but it hasn't?
Sure. So, I mean, I'm sure, as you know, the committee had a pretty long span starting in April last year, and while the major mandate was, as you say, to rationalize,
and you made guest appearances on that, just to put that out.
No, that's right. So we've had pretty healthy debate around almost over the last 12 months, and many issues were discussed. So maybe the report may not necessarily capture every wish list or the expectation, but there definitely are items which we expect the industry to kind of still come back with their feedback. Having said that, I think what the outcome of the report, to the extent of simplifying, rationalizing the FPI regime, removing all the complexity that had crept in, I think it has done a fairly good job in terms of achieving that objective. And I would expect, with the recommendations being kind of translated into regulations and rules, we should see a very significant positive kind of mindset from investors about taking away a lot of red tapeism or bureaucracy in KYC and other processes. So I think to that extent it has really made some achievement on that, and we do hope that the industry kind of sees it in that light. The other aspect on the whether it's on the investment side, whether it's on some of the other recommendations which are also part of it but required more deliberation, I think, yes, there were issues discussed, there were views expressed, both from the industry and the regulators. And there were certain calls taken in terms of phasing out some of the approaches. So maybe all of them may not necessarily find.
For instance, any specific areas that you thought the committee would address and hasn't really come?
So, I mean, I think one of the big debate which happened after the April circular was the whole NRI participation, which took away a very significant amount of time, and the imposition of the cap on NRI participation through the FPI route. A lot of discussion has happened, and I think forms part of the note here. But we could not ultimately come to a conclusion whether to kind of remove the cap of 50, because there are obvious concerns from the regulator about parallel routes existing for NRIs and FPIs. And at the same time, they've also considered kind of a path-breaking route to say whether can we collapse PIS route into an FPI. But obviously that requires a lot more and much beyond SEBI's mandate, because it also is RBI. Okay. So I think some of those debates happen and very constructive, but I guess the outcome would still need to be seen in terms of that.
Okay, let me start by laying out the key process-related changes that the committee has recommended. These include a fast-track onboarding process for certain Category 2 FPIs like public retail funds, moving pension funds from Category 2 to Category 1, allowing local custodians to rely on the KYC done by their global counterparts, and making the FPI account opening process faster but relying on online PAN verification. Richie, what impact do you see of these changes if they are implemented?
Definitely. I think some of these changes also highlight the kind of or the brand of capital that SEBI wants to attract to India. Patient long-term investors is something that SEBI seems to have driven as a theme. So clearly, like you summarized, pension funds being elevated to status of Category 1 FPI, university endowments now also being formally recognized as a Category 2 FPI. Then easier norms for entities which are largely or broadly held by Category 1 investors, central banks, and so on and so forth. All of them definitely seem to encourage mobilizing capital from investors who are, like I said, patient long-term investors. Doing away with the paperwork around protected cell structures, segregated portfolio companies, that also is a key movement. A lot of jurisdictions today, whether it is Singapore through SWAC, Hong Kong, open-end companies, UK also had last year, as a reaction to global financial crisis, introduced protected cell structures as an essential component of any fund being set up. So clearly SEBI's recognition that protected cell structures are no longer a taboo and they should be encouraged as long as the beneficial ownerships are being declared. I think that also is a very good move on part of SEBI and opens up the FPI space for a lot of global funds which otherwise would have struggled to meet some of these conditions.
Okay. Siddharth, any quick comments on the process?
No, I think just to add, I think there were a lot of deliberation, and the approach taken by the work group was really that when the FPI categorization was undertaken, which was a risk-based approach, and for lack of better classification of certain types of entities, they were kind of put into certain brackets. So the example like retail funds, while they are highly regulated.
When you say retail fund, it will be mutual
funds or insurance companies and all. Unfortunately, the bracket was under Category 2, which also included kind of hedge funds and other categories. So the risk weightage for them, while in reality would have been much lower, but because of the categorization had got clubbed under that. Right. So a lot of that rationalization, in my view, I think one, clearly sends out a very positive message to these classes of institutional investors. Secondly, I think the endowment, because I mean it was almost from the transition from the FII to FPI, really put them from a deemed broad base or a criteria to a Category 3, which was the highest risk.
Just for the benefit of our viewers, the categories, basically determine the kind of KYC you do and the kind of documentation you sort of go through while registering yourself with the market regulator.
Exactly.
Please go on.
So there, for example, endowments, large university endowments, which is again a very patient form of capital, can kind of definitely be welcome in a market like ours, had got classified by virtue of the classification as Category 3 and had to go through KYCs, which we know for many of our clients was very frustrating. And to that extent, I think that correction which the committee has now recommended, that certain universities which have been in existence for 5 years
and they come from an
FATF member, I think they should be subjected to the same level 2 KYC rather than a level 3. Okay. So those corrections, I feel, clearly would encourage a lot more institutional long-term capital to come in. Okay. And finally, the structural flexibility. Because I think there was a lot of legacy perceptions that existed about opaque structures, multi-class or a protected cell structures not being kind of transparent to give a government the comfort to allow such structures to come in. I think what has helped in terms of the beneficial owner test, right. I think it was felt that now that the BO test is the really primary test for determining this, the structure should really not disadvantage anyone from coming in. And
so I think what was the problem earlier, if you could spell that out for me?
So earlier the perception was that when you come through a protected cell company structures or multi-class or a segregated cell company structure, these structures kind of in a way were opaque to disclose who the ultimate beneficiary was.
Right.
And hence SEBI, based on the past JPC and some of those reports, felt that these structures are not desirable for the Indian market, and hence they had put these restrictions that you cannot have any structure which was opaque, where I cannot have the ability to see who the downline investors you are investing on behalf of. And now with the test having moved entirely to a BO, you necessarily look through each of these structures.
And why are these structures useful?
So these structures are very useful for different contexts. So for example, UCITS. And I think post-Lehman, the biggest concern has been for institutional investors around segregation of liabilities.
Okay.
Whether it's proprietary versus client funds or multiple client funds who may want to use segregated portfolio structures so that their liabilities are contained. And that's where the PCC structures kind of come into play. And that flexibility was taken away based on the FPI regime and while creating exception for certain PCC structures under the existing framework, the trigger was that it has to be a regulatory requirement to segregate. A contractual requirement will not allow these structures to be used in an FPI.
Okay.
So now the new recommendation will say there is really no need to kind of put these artificial restrictions.
So you can continue to use these structures as long as you comply with the SEBI's earlier beneficial owner circular. Okay, all right, great. The second important change has to do with how we look at the broad-based criteria which needs to be fulfilled if a certain FPI needs to seek registration under Category 2. Now it's defined as a fund incorporated outside India which has at least 20 investors with no investor holding more than 49% of the shares or units of the fund. The committee has suggested that broad basing shouldn't be just determined only through shares, but should also extend to any economic form. Richie, what has prompted this suggestion and how will this change things for FPIs?
Right. See, I think as far as the broad-based criteria is concerned, I think there are a couple of significant changes. The more significant change we saw was SEBI also for the first time through the committee recommendations keen to move a position that if we are relying on a fund to meet the 20 investor requirement, then that underlying fund should itself also be broad-based, and over and above it should hold at least a minimum of 25% economic interest in the FPI. Earlier, there was a situation which the committee report sort of illustrates that you could have two investors at 49% each and another broad-based fund being in the mix at about 2%, which still makes the entire platform a broad-based vehicle. To plug that, the recommendation seems to be that such fund should at least hold 25%. Now, which is where I think the feedback which the industry could convey to SEBI or to the working group in this regard could be that under the current laws itself, SEBI mandates that if an FPI is relying on another fund or another shareholder which is a broad-based entity, then it should meet all the other eligibility criteria prescribed by SEBI to be an eligible FPI. So in that case, should a 25% test be applied? Should the test at all be applied? If the test should be applied, then would 25% be the right threshold? Can we consider a 10 or a 15? There could be a lot of reasoned basis for which the industry could ask for the test not to be applied or a lower threshold. So there clearly is a lot of scope for industry feedback for the committee to take.
Okay, so that to pick up from the earlier point that Richie made, the example that the committee has used is that let's say to achieve the broad-based criteria, there are probably existing structures which say there is one shareholder at 49, there's another shareholder at 49, and then there is a fund which is come in at 2%, and then this fund perhaps may have 20 investors. And because of this 2% fund is how you are achieving this broad-based criteria, which the committee is suggesting is not really in the spirit of the regulations, right? How will these, changing the structure of some of these existing funds in the market play out now, and what do you see as the impact of this?
No, so I think, yes, you rightly pointed out that was the concern raised from a regulatory side, that the idea of offering a broad-based status should also in spirit show that there has to be a reasonable economic interest of such a broad-based investor for the entity to qualify for broad-based. And having said that, I also feel, and I think I'm sure a lot of feedback that we are also getting from the industry, this will be an area where you'll see a significant amount of pushback because fund structures, whether that 25% threshold is something which is too high for a lot of fund structures to kind of comply with to meet the broad base, failing which they will all get essentially classified as Cat 3. Or whether maybe a reasonable threshold, and I think we might, and I'm sure industry will give feedback to the work group on this.
Do you know the thought process behind this 25% threshold?
So actually, I mean, there's no science the way I look at it.
Understood.
I think the idea was that there should be a meaningful interest, and it cannot be a nominal interest. So 2% was seen as nominal. And
Are
then
there too many of these 2% kind of structures in the market?
Well, I think people may have in the past used it.
Okay.
And that is exactly where the concern for the regulator was, that it is not meeting the spirit of why that flexibility was offered. But I guess whether that 25% should be 25 or should it be 10, I think that's something that the industry will feedback. I would think anything upward of 10 starts showing a material. So even just to kind of draw a parallel, a portfolio investment to strategic investment now under FEMA is 10 is a threshold. Yeah. So maybe that could be a threshold which can be used for.
Understood. The third important suggestion has to do with clubbing restrictions. Now today, anything below 10%, as Siddharth also pointed out, in a listed entity qualifies as FPI, and anything more than that as FDI. If a FPI has common ownership of 50% or more or common control, they belong to the same investor group, and the investments of all such group entities is looked at to determine the 10% cap. Now, this is the existing position. What the committee is now saying that is, if any entity of such a group has an FDI or a foreign direct investment in the same stock, that will be accounted for as well. So let's say if Group X has a FDI investment of 20% in a particular stock, and further portfolio investment that comes from this group will either have to be recharacterized as FDI, or the FPI entity will need to sell down. Richie, is that how you're reading this recommendation?
Right, that is correct. So I think this actually comes from some of the earlier committees that were also formed, that could we consider participation of less than 10% economic interest as a portfolio investment, and anything more than 10% as a strategic investment. So participation by a single entity or different entities but part of the same investor group is intended perhaps to be combined together, and to assess whether the group's participation in the company now, is it below 10%, or through your other routes of participations have you sort of exceeded the 10% limit, and accordingly see where you sit on the classification, whether as a foreign portfolio investor or as an FDI on the other hand. So yes, that's a correct summary of where we are right now.
Okay, so Siddharth, let's say I invested in a particular stock, let's say in the cement space, and as an FDI investor, I picked up 20% when the stock is not listed, right? Now the stock gets listed, is on the market, and I, as the same group, through my FPI entity, wants to now invest further in this group. So is the committee saying that here you can't even begin to do that transaction, or you can't like begin to buy because you're already at 20% as a group in that particular stock? Or are they saying that you can materialize that transaction, but then you either characterize that investment as FDI, which you do on the exchange, let's say through your portfolio investment route, or you sell down?
Right. So I think first and foremost, the whole concept of this transition from FPI to FDI was something that came out of the FEMA amendments. So it was really not the work group that picked up this issue. It was an issue which came out from FEMA, but it lacked any transition mechanism. So while the intent was laid down that anything less than 10 is foreign portfolio investment, anything in excess of 10 should be FDI. Coming to your point, in a specific situation where an entity owns 20% under FDI, and now whether another group entity of that would be looking to acquire additional shares through the FPI route. Again, I don't think the committee, the principle there was that any such acquisition should be treated as FDI investment. So any additional, because the intent of the party is to be a strategic investor. So irrespective of how you acquire shares. The execution mechanism is where I think there is still a degree of grayness that would I be allowed to still go ahead and acquire as an FPI on the market? Though I will classify this as an FDI and will transfer these investments into a separate account which will be an FDI account. I think that seems to be most logical because the status of the entity is not being taken away by virtue of this investment. So the status would still continue to be an FPI, but the investment is getting reclassified as FDI. So following the same principle, at least my personal view would be that in that scenario, there should still be a flexibility for the entity to use the FPI route to acquire shares to the extent of the permissible limit, but those shares should all then be treated as FDI in aggregate at the group level.
Oh, so then let's say, so what are the implications of when this investment gets characterized as FDI? Because anyway, it's on market sort of purchase. So let's say when you want to sell, do you then have different implication for the investment that came as FDI versus for FPI?
So actually the distinction over the years has become, especially when it comes to exit, has become lesser and lesser.
Okay.
And if you actually look at it, even FDI is free to sell its shares on the market, like an FPI. So from an exit perspective, technically you are allowed to sell these shares on the market. The issue would be if you are selling it off market. As an FPI, you are not allowed to do so. As an FDI, you are allowed to do that subject to pricing.
But this situation will not occur for, let's say, in an unlisted scenario, right?
That situation, because in an unlisted scenario,
FPI
anyway today at least are not permitted to invest, though it's part of the recommendation.
Yeah,
that's right.
In the to be listed sort of space. Okay, so the actual sort of difference is really in this recharacterization that happens. But why create all these segregations if there's no material impact, as you are saying, of reclassifying my investment anyway?
I mean, the fact is, because the two parallel regimes for foreign investors exist, you need to necessarily have limits for that. If you go back to the Mayaram committee and maybe some of those committees which had deliberated whether we create a uniform foreign investment caps and then remove all of these, I guess at that point you may not need such a classification. But till then, the FPI has a different tax treatment. For example, they have a specific tax code.
So that's what I was wondering, that what would be the implications for that investment? Is tax an angle there?
Well, tax could be an angle because as an FPI, you do enjoy certain specific tax provisions which kind of mitigate or kind of define your tax status. As an FDI, you may not necessarily benefit out of it. Plus, suppose, for example, there are indirect transfer exemptions which have been made for FPI investors, which do not extend to FDI investors.
So I lose all of this the moment I recharacterize, I refuse to sell down and I recharacterize my FPI investment to FDI. In
theory, that's the implication today.
Okay.
I don't think tax has really kind of provisions have been deliberated in the context of this transition, because one argument is that the status of the investor is not changing.
Correct.
The status of the investment is changing.
Right.
So to the extent that the benefits have been extended to the status of an investor as an FPI, he should continue to be eligible for those benefits rather than taking those benefits away. So today, if the investing entity is still an FPI, there should be no reason why he should suddenly become an FDI just because one of my other group companies has acquired additional shares.
Well, if this comes in, all the best arguing that with the tax department.
I think it's always going to be
a contentious topic. Okay. The last point I want to touch upon is the liberalization of the investment cap. Today, FEMA allows FPIs to invest up to 24% in a listed entity. They can go up to the sectoral limits as long as a company has specifically passed a resolution to allow for it. Now, the committee has recommended that keep the sectoral limit as a default for FPI FPI investments, and if a company doesn't want an FPI or FPIs to get that kind of headroom, they can pass specific resolution to disallow it. Richie, what has prompted this suggestion and what could be its potential impact in your opinion?
Right. See, I think time and again we keep receiving feedback and keep, through exchange of, ideas and market feedback that clearly India seeks to, and all the regulators have been trying to see how India can be made more attractive, gain more weightage on global indices, so MSCI and so on and so forth. And one feedback has always been access to market and access to the constituents of the index. So if companies, like you summarized, while they have been allowed 24% bandwidth for all FPIs, they can increase it to the sectoral cap. But companies had been doing it in different phases. Some have been doing it certain percentages on a very ad hoc basis. There was no uniformity as such, which definitely made it a little more challenging to decipher how much bandwidth a concerned company has, especially if they are a constituent of an index. Then it gets that much more difficult to track the index appropriately. Hence, this move seems to have been motivated, that's our initial reading of it, that can we sort of increase the bandwidth or the headroom to the actual sectoral limit, and then leave it to the company to sort of figure if they want to sort of reduce the cap.
All right, last comment, Siddharth. We run out of time, but quickly, do you want to add something on this specific recommendation?
Yeah, so I think, again, it goes back to the spirit of foreign investments. And I think when the government moved to a unified foreign investment caps, it goes in that spirit, that no matter whether you bring it through FDI, FPI, let the sectoral cap be the overall cap. Within that, if the companies need to kind of restrict for whatever reason, and that flexibility exists even for any other entity under FDI, you may pass a resolution, but the default should be what is the sectoral cap. So I think it's a great move to kind of also eliminate this hurdle that an FPI looking to invest first need to go out and see whether the company has raised its cap or not. I mean, today you'll be free to invest in sectors which are otherwise 100% open, and then the company will need to monitor that, okay, do I need to restrict this further? And so I think it's definitely will increase the weightage and the availability of the basket of securities for FPI investors.
All right, great. You both have said some great things in the committee's suggestions and showered praises on them. So I'm guessing that you've gotten good feedback from your clients. Richie, Siddharth, thank you so much for joining us here on the Fine Print, and thank you so much for watching. We'll stay on top of this story and come back to you as and when SEBI notifies the HR Khan committee suggestions. Thank you for watching.